Remember this thread? For those who weren't around, an anon who worked as a production editor at a small publisher posted a series of rare photos from a book he was compositing. The book got cancelled when the old man providing the photos pulled the plug and sold the entire collection to someone else. The anon was pissed about his wasted effort, and shared all the photos and text he had from a backup copy of the layout file. Beside the fascinating and all too rare OC he provided, I was struck by something that Anon said while explaining why he felt the urge to share the material. There are all kinds of ways to get rich. Most involve hard work and the willingness to put your career above everything else. The funny thing about inheriting money from a distant relative is that it doesn't seem real, because you didn't earn it with your own hands, or see it add up and compound month by month, year by year, because it just magically shows up one day in your bank account. It tends to feel like dream money. So a little while ago, I began to ask myself, what does a person do with dream money? Most of you have probably heard of Sotheby's, the venerable auction house founded in London but now headquartered in New York. They broker most of the famous art auctions that fetch millions. This is common knowledge. Lesser known are the thousands of private sales they handle each year. When you want to sell or buy a valuable object, the last thing you want is everyone to know you own it. Imagine what a resource it would be for thieves. So the vast majority of Sotheby's auctions are private. Often, even the very fact of a sale is kept out of the public eye, and the pool of potential buyers is strictly controlled. In fact, their website has a preferred access section that is accessible by invitation only. Well, fortunately for me, I happen to have a preferred access account. I also have a taste for the macabre, hence my presence here. So imagine my surprise when I logged in last week and saw what they had for sale under private auctions. Clearly, whoever bought the collection from the old guy was trying to make a huge profit by selling the photos piecemeal. Obviously, this isn't standard stuff for Sotheby's, but in October, they sometimes have a theme string of private auctions. Last year, they had a 16th century grimoire and a cache of used torture implements from the Tower of London, among other things. The first thing that struck me was how overpriced they were. The second was the collection included 30 photos all told, 16 more than in the original thread. The third thing I noticed was the complete lack of provenance for the collection. This is pretty strange for Sotheby's, so I wrote them an email about it. A few hours later I got this reply. In the meantime, I took screenshots of each photo and copy-pasted the backstories they included to interest bidders. I'll be posting them here to share with my X-File brothers and sisters. I'll post them in order they were listed in the auction, which is different than the original thread, I think. But I'll follow the first Anon's lead by adding some close-up zooms. Like I said, you'll recognize 14 of them from the previous thread. I'll duplicate them here for just completeness sake, but there are 16 new ones as well, and as far as I know, X has never seen them. Happy Halloween, X. Don't say I never gave you anything. Stick around after the show to see what's in the box, after the images were posted. So, at the start of this thread, I asked a question that probably seemed rhetorical. What do you do with dream money? If you're a normal person, the answer is obvious. You buy a dream for yourself or someone you love. Those of us who like the dark and the things we decorate it with do things a little differently. So, what did I do? I bought myself some nightmares. The box contained the original images. Photo 17. Brodie's Wraith. Jackson Brodie was a rising fourth-year medical student at the University of Pennsylvania when he decided to take a semester off and travel southern Europe. According to his mother, Brodie was suffering from nervous exhaustion and the persistent delusion of being haunted by a wraith, or spirit, of an old female cadaver that he dissected. Fearing an imminent breakdown, he hoped sometime touring the Mediterranean would lift his spirits, so to speak. Letters and postcards sent home to his mother seemed to suggest his condition was greatly improving when he decided to extend his stay by 2 weeks and see some of northern Africa. He left Spain by boat in the fall of 1921, stopped in Gibraltar for a night, and then went to Tangiers. Unfortunately, his last letter home displayed a steep regression into madness. He claimed the wraith had followed him to Tangiers and was stalking him through the dark winding streets of the ancient city. He included this blurry photo as proof, except what befell Brodie remains unknown, as all contact subsequently ceased and his body was never recovered. Photo 1. Charlie Noonan's last interview. Charlie Noonan was an amateur folklorist who traveled throughout the South and southwestern United States during the early years of the 20th century, collecting tall tales and stories of the supernatural. According to his wife, Ellie, Charlie was told a story one day by an Oklahoma farmer about a strange woman who lived alone on an isolated property in the Panhandle. The farmer claimed the woman was not a woman at all, but something else. Something that hid its true nature beneath a headscarf, and was never seen without a large dog by its side. Noonan was apparently intrigued enough to try searching for the woman during one of his research road trips. He was never seen again. Ellie Noonan was later contacted by a Tulsa pawnbroker who remembered reading about her husband's disappearance in the papers. After finding his name engraved on a camera sold to him by an itinerant, the pawnbroker returned the camera, and Miss Noonan had the film inside developed in the hopes of finding clues as to his whereabouts. This was the only photo on the roll. Unfortunately, neither the location of the property nor the name of the farmer who told them the story was recorded in Noonan's notes. There were a few people in the original thread and in reaction to subsequent posting of this photo who questioned the authenticity of this image, particularly the dog. Looking at it closely, I completely disagree. I think that what looks like doctoring is actually caused by movement of the dog's legs. Zoomed in, there's nothing to suggest shopping, no difference in texture or pixel density. I have no idea what kind of vetting these photos went through, but I seriously doubt Sotheby's is going to sell a Photoshop. Photo 22, Forever Lost. Ernst and Rachel Tappig later admitted they were necking when their daughters, Lily and Hilda, wandered away from the picnic table. They had spontaneously laid down near an old estate outside Hornbad Meinberg in the Tettelberg forest. Exactly how long it took the Tappigs to realize the girls were gone remains in dispute, but this much is certain. They were wearing white jumpers over black turtlenecks when they disappeared. They were virtually inseparable, and their bodies were never found despite extensive searches. Lily and Hilda's case briefly became news again in 1957, 5 years after they went disappearing, when this photo came to light. It was taken by a Belgian tourist named Frans Irwin, who claims he saw nothing moving throughout the forest that day. Photo 5. Ida in the Archives. Tim Stewart had only been working at the Cumberland County Archives for a little over 2 months when he took this photo, which allegedly captures the ghost of Ida Clark, an undersized, misshapen child who was taken down there and raped and murdered by her custodian uncle in 1953. In the afterlife, Ida evidently enjoys displacing objects and whispering in the ears of anyone caught alone in the archives. Turnover of the staff there had always been abnormally high, but rumors of this photo had made it almost impossible to keep employees for very long. Photo 15. Lily Palmer's Eyes. Lily Palmer was not quite 4 when she began to experience what her doctors would later call acute sensory hallucinations. This photo, taken by Lily's mother Annette on Halloween night 1952, purportedly captures the onset of her disorder. Lily and her Filipino nanny were setting out for a round of trick-or-treating when the child suddenly screamed and began to claw at her eyes. It was sometime before she was calm enough to speak, but when asked what she saw, Lily reportedly spoke out, things crawling in her eyes. Several days later, while unsupervised in her bedroom, Lily punctured both of her eyes with one of her mother's knitting needles. Photo 29. Nensha Akuma. 17-year-old Akiko Nakamura had been missing for nearly 2 months when her mother, Masami, finally gave up hope on the Tokyo police and turned to Daisuke Izakaya, one of Japan's last remaining practitioners of Nensha, or projected thermography. Izakaya also claimed to be a remote viewer capable of finding missing persons with his mind, and would combine these talents to project what he saw onto Polaroids that, theoretically, would help locate them. Despite numerous attempts, this ghastly image was the only successful result. According to Izakaya, the shining object is a mirror, used to deflect psychic intrusions, and the reason his further attempts failed, according to Masami, the thing holding it is an Akuma, or demon. When asked later whether the image had helped her locate her daughter, Masami was curt and blunt. "Yes," she said, "my daughter is in hell." Photo 26, Still Life. Michael Evans was 15 and friendless in 1969 when he began wandering around town and taking photos of abandoned buildings and factories that were already beginning to swallow Detroit. He was fascinated by the swiftness with which nature could reclaim a man-made space, and especially liked to capture vines growing up walls. The images preceding this one on the roll suggest that is exactly what he was doing that fateful Saturday in April before something caught his eye in the window above, and he raised the lens to photograph it. How he ended up inside the house, what caused him to leave his camera behind, or why he didn't simply run away are questions that may never be answered. Photo 2. The Axeman of New Orleans. Edouard Martel was an unsuccessful French photographer and inventor who traveled throughout the US during the first 2 decades of the 20th century, trying to drum up interest and investors for a device that added timer and automatic exposure features to Kodak's popular line of folding Brownie cameras. During his travels, he took thousands of automated photos to test and refine his invention. Often, he would wake up early, set up hidden cameras in inconspicuous spots on the streets of whatever city he happened to be in, and then walk to a nearby cafe or bar so that he could capture the candid scenes of daily life to remember his travels by. The best of these photos were selected for Martel's one and only gallery show in Paris in 1924. Unfortunately, Martel died penniless and unknown in 1955, and it was left to his daughter Jean to sort through the boxes and boxes of photos he left behind, to see what should be kept and what could be discarded. During this process, she came across this photo, taken in New Orleans on the morning of October 28, 1919, a few hours before Martel boarded a steamer ship and returned to France. It turns out that Martel hated motion blurs in his photographs because he thought that would reflect badly on the speed and accuracy of his lens mechanism. This prejudice made him cast aside and overlook what was probably the most important photo he ever took. What makes this photo so special? The night before it was taken, the notorious and still unidentified serial killer, only known as the Axeman of New Orleans, had committed his last murder, hacking Mike Pepitone to death in his bedroom, and then fleeing the scene just as Pepitone's wife was discovering the body. Could this be him returning to his residence? It's impossible to say, but if it is, the image appears to belie the legend. Based on the shaky testimony of Pauline and Mary Bruno, the prevailing prejudice of the time, that only a black man was capable of such savagery. Photo 6. The Collinwood Fire. This was the last known photo taken inside the Lakeview School in Collinwood, Ohio, before it was consumed by fire on March 4, 1908, killing 172 students, 2 teachers, and 1 rescuer. The fire started when a ceiling joist ignited from a nearby steam pipe. Flames blocked escape routes, leading to panic and a stampede that trapped a large number of victims in a stairwell, where they were cooked alive. Additional casualties were incurred when burning students jumped from 2nd and 3rd story windows. Everyone in this photo perished, except for Mr. Olsen, seated at the far right in the back row. The spectral artifacts in the photo remain unexplained. Photo 7. The Cornfield Cannibal. When Francis Dodson turned 7 in 1960, his parents gave him a relatively inexpensive 35mm camera. The following summer, the 3 of them toured Iowa and Nebraska in a Chevy Apache pickup truck, outfitted with an Alaskan camper shell. Fran liked to stay in the camper while his parents drove and took roll after roll of random shots out of the back as they rode down the road. He took this one, somewhere outside of Dubuque. When the roll was developed and his parents saw the photo, they asked Fran what he had seen. He allegedly replied, "A dead black man holding a white man's head by the hair." Who or what the photo actually depicts has never been conclusively determined. Photo 16. The Death of John Ulsted. This prophetically torn photograph depicts a regimental color guard of the Union Army 1 month before they marched into the Battle of Antietam, September 1862. The gentleman on the far right, named John Ulsted, had the right side of his face and right arm blown off by cannon fire at the start of those hostilities. It is unknown exactly when the damage to the photo occurred. Photo 9. The Disappearances of Miss Yurno. During her later years, Josephine Yurno would take a walk every evening at dusk around her beloved neighborhood in Norwich, Connecticut. On November 12, 1935, she set out as usual and never returned. Extensive searches were conducted by a large team of volunteers and the Norwich police force, but no sign of her was ever found. 3 years later, Miss Yurno was found in front of her neighbor's house, without a mark on her body and in perfect health. When asked where she had been, Miss Yurno was unable to understand the question. From her point of view, no time had passed at all. Against the advice of her neighbors and her doctor, she refused all medical treatment and resumed her life as if nothing had ever happened, including her nightly walks. Another neighbor snapped a shot of her in the fall of 1938, Clouds of smoke from piles of burning leaves give it the appropriately eerie feel. On the same date, in November 1940, 5 years after her initial disappearance, Miss Yurno vanished again. This time, she was never seen again. Photo 29. The Fate of Sally York. The 1912 threshing of Little Sally York in the cotton loom of North Fork Textile Mill was one of a handful of such incidents that helped legislators push the Needing Owning Act of 1916, the first child labor law in American history. From the time of the accident until the mill's closing 4 decades later, workers consistently complained of cold spots, strange noises, and sudden taps on the shoulder when nobody was near. The mill's foreman never paid these complaints any mind until this photograph surfaced in 1932. It was taken by a traveling photographer known as Benny Johnson, who promptly sold it to the Norfolk Gazette for an unprecedented $10. The mill had shut down for the Christmas holidays and was empty at the time. The photo was later blamed for the closing of the mill, though the Great Depression was more likely the cause of that. Photo 19. The Ghost of Sarah Eustace. Danvers State Hospital, formerly Danvers State Lunatic Asylum, was a Kirkbride-style psychiatric hospital built in 1874 on what was then an isolated site in rural Massachusetts. Like all Kirkbridge asylums, it was famous for its Gothic architecture and its use of now outdated medical techniques to treat insanity. Danvers is often cited as the birthplace of the prefrontal lobotomy. Danvers had several other claims to fame. It was the inspiration for the fictional Arkham Sanatorium that appeared in several stories by H.P. Lovecraft, and which in turn inspired the Arkham Asylum in the fictional Batman universe. It was also where the cult horror film Session 9 was filmed. The film put the vast network of tunnels beneath the Danvers to good cinematic effect. It's no accident the filmmakers chose to use these tunnels, as rumors of their haunting had dogged Danvers for over 100 years. The most famous story concerns Sarah Eustace, a patient who escaped her ward in 1955 and snuck into the tunnel system. Despite multiple searches and a week-long lockdown of the asylum, Sarah was never seen again, and it was assumed she died down there, lost, thirsty, and alone. A nurse at Danvers named Gail Malloy became obsessed with Sarah's story and spent many of her off hours searching the tunnels for her remains. Though she never found a body, she did snap this photo in late 1966, which suggests Sarah Eustace walks the Danvers tunnels to this very day. Photo 14. The Ghoul in the Graveyard. One would think that if ghosts exist and linger in the places where their bodies lie, getting a photo of one in a graveyard should be a relatively easy undertaking, but this shot is one of the few examples that has not been explained or debunked. It was taken by Ellery Reist while visiting her father's grave in Arlington Cemetery in the March of 1949. If Miss Reist was trying to perpetuate a hoax, it was a strangely subtle one because she never showed the picture to anyone. In fact, she never had the chance. Her son Paul found a roll of film. It was in a bedside table while clearing the house after her death. Photo 28. The Goblin of Sulphur Fork. As far as back as anyone living could remember, there'd always been a legend of something not quite human living in the old abandoned house at the end of Sulphur Fork Trail, near Wildersville, Tennessee, where the road forks and peters off into dirt and brambles. It was a typical tall tale used to scare children, and few adults paid the legend any mind until this one blurry photo surfaced in the early 40s and forced the sheriff to level and burn the building to keep the peace. The whole episode has more than a shake of Brothers Grimm in it. Marla Jenkins, the teenage girl who took it, was evidently an odd thing, prone to telling elaborate lies, and there are many who think the photo was a hoax. But if so, Marla was hoaxing herself as well. She bought the burnt land on which the old house had stood with a small inheritance from her grandfather, built herself a ramshackle cabin, and lived there for the rest of her life. In time, a new legend arose around the strange old lady in the woods and the creature she liked to ride naked in the moonlight. Photo 4. The Grand Cavern Cryptids. This photo was taken in 1895 by an amateur splunker/photographer named Orrin Jeffries while exploring an unmapped section of the Grand Caverns in southwestern Virginia. At the time it was taken, Jeffries was conducting photographic experiments using super long exposures to see if anything at all could be captured in total absence of light, otherwise known as cave darkness. He would situate himself on level ground, extinguish his lantern, and then opened the lens of his homemade box camera for as long as he could stand the darkness. During one of those experiments, he heard something approach from the deeper recesses of the cave. Frightened, Jeffries abandoned his experiments and set off one of the Blitzlicht flashes he used for taking traditional photos underground. According to the report he later gave to the local newspaper, Jeffries saw 3 humanoid creatures staring at him from the shadows, and took off running in the other direction and didn't stop running until he was topside. Several days later, he returned with 3 other men to retrieve the box camera. This is the image that was recorded on the film inside. Photo 10. The Harlow Twins. 1938, Evergreen Park, Illinois, outside Chicago. Billy and Stevie Harlow were riding in the front seat with their mother Tammy when their Ford sedan collided head-on with the Chrysler. During the collision, the car spun in such a way as to impact 2 additional vehicles. Tammy Harlow survived, but the boys were ejected through the windshield and killed instantly. A crime scene photographer from the local paper took this shot as a crew of volunteers worked frantically to free John Downing, the driver of the Chrysler. It appears that little Billy and Stevie stuck around to watch. Photo 11. The Minister's Secret. In life, Reverend Allen Yarborough was a respected minister in the small village of Wickerford, Rhode Island. In death, he became a regular spirit visitor to the seances held by Anne Marie Cantillano, a local medium. During his manifestations, Yarborough, speaking through Cantillano, would often make cryptic references to a series of secret crimes that he had committed, for which he was never fingered or punished. Concrete details were sketchy and hard to verify, but the things he said were horrifying and seemed to involve the ritual dismemberment of several unnamed local children whom Yarborough had evidently abducted and kept imprisoned in a forgotten sub-basement of St. Paul's Episcopal. The photo seen here was the result of an experiment conducted during one of the last of these manifestations. Cantillano invoked Yarborough as usual, and then at a prearranged signal 2 attendees tied back the curtains so that a third could take a photo in the natural lighting. Opinions differ on whether the distorted visage reflects the torture of the damned or the ecstasy of bloodletting. The Phrygian Djinn. In northwestern Turkey lies a notoriously isolated and atmospheric region known as the Phrygian Highlands. Ancient rock-cut tombs and relatively modern graveyards sit side by side, essentially making the area one huge necropolis. When traveling through this haunted landscape, it is fairly common to experience something strange, but rarely as strange as what Frida Palmero encountered on September 5, 1956. Palmero was an Italian archaeologist specializing in Byzantine funerary sculpture. She was walking alone, photographing an unpublished cemetery near Ayazin, when the air seemed to change and grow heavy, as if to portend a storm. She later described hearing a sound like wind across the mouth of 1,000 bottles, and then something became momentarily visible on the outcrop high above her, just long enough for her to grab this shot of what was subsequently dubbed the Phrygian Djinn. Photo 12. The Solo Man. This photo of a typical turn-of-the-century London tenement was taken by an amateur photographer named Michael Oliphant using a box camera in 1911. He was drawn to this particular set of flats by persistent rumors that the building was haunted by a tall, solo man who had a terrible habit of leaning over and staring at tenants while they slept, only to scare the living daylights out of them when they awoke. Oliphant himself saw nothing on the day, but he later recalled inexplicably losing his balance while taking the shot, as if someone or something had collided with him while rushing past. Photo 20. The Sorensen Tragedy. The Sorensens were a Danish family who immigrated to the United States between 1905 and 1906. They arrived with their eldest child, Anders, seen on a donkey, and settled on a farmstead in Missouri. 3 more children, Simone, Frike, and Mathilde, center, right, and in the wagon respectively, soon followed. This photo, taken in 1916, captures all 4 of the children a few weeks before the tragedy. The 3 eldest kids were apparently playing forts in the hay barn and must have fallen asleep. Their father, Nicholas, drove a wooden hay sweep into the pile and dismembered all 3, in locations accurately suggested by the flaw in the photo. Mathilde, the youngest, was inside the house with her mother at the time and not hurt. According to the son of the neighbor later interviewed by the author, the donkey later died in an equally hideous fashion by getting its head caught in a barbed wire fence and nearly decapitating itself in a frenzy to get free. The final detail cannot be corroborated. Photo 13. The Spectre of Viola Peters. Viola Peters was a well-born spinster who lived alone in the small rural town of McKaysville, Georgia. She was much loved in her community for her charitable contributions to the Baptist church, the soup kitchen, and the local orphanage. especially during the Depression, when those institutions subsisted almost entirely on her largesse. In July of 1935, Viola was brutally raped and murdered by a drifter named Tom Cullen, who worked briefly at the nearby copper refinery. Cullen proceeded to stay in Viola's house and savage her corpse for an additional 17 days before he was caught and captured. A posse of enraged locals stormed the county jail, took Cullen and lynched him from the old bridge over Toccoa River. This photo was taken by Garrett Killian, a witness to the lynching, and caused quite a stir when it was published a few days later in the Atlanta Constitution. To most, it suggested that Viola's spirit achieved some measure of peace by attending her killer's execution, but some twisted minds saw in her forlorn countenance a longing to get one last look at her one and only lover. Photo 21. The Spirit Tribe. Dozens of documented massacres occurred during what later became known as the American Indian Wars, and most of these infamous sites now bear historical markers and official apologies from Uncle Sam. How many more remain undocumented and only remain in the annals of the dead is unknown, and will likely remain so, unless, of course, more photographs surface like this one taken by Graham Wheeling in 1971 on Bureau of Land Management land near Kanab, Utah. Wheeling was camped out in the dry riverbed, pulling what he liked to call a cowboy weekend, when he noticed that a carpet of fog was rolling in. As fog is extremely rare in the water-challenged region, he figured he should try to photograph it. He set up his tripod and took a 2-minute exposure in low light. Only later in the darkroom did he learn what he was really looking at. Photo 18. The Stevenson Family Portrait. Who says ghosts don't have a sense of humor? The Stevensons were a wealthy Boston family, proud of the industry and longevity with which most of the clan was blessed. This portrait, taken in 1945, was an effort to gather the oldest Stevensons together, with one of the youngest, Emilia Center, age 102, was granted the honor of matriarch, while little Ophelia was the token child at 18 months. What the Stevensons did not realize until the photo was developed was that they had been joined that day by one of their deceased. James Pullman Stevenson, 1835 to 1932, seated at left between his niece Jenny and his cousin Alfred, was easily identified by several of those present, and was remembered fondly as a rascally uncle known for pranks and dirty jokes. Photo 27. The torture of Tilly Jane. In the era before abortion was legalized in the United States, short of a straightened coat hanger, the only option for a woman who wanted to terminate a pregnancy was to locate a doctor willing to do the job on the sly. Some of those doctors were good men, and some were not. At least one was a psychotic sadist. We know this today because Tilly Jane Priddick told her best friend Alice on the night before her shackled, mutilated body was found in a Philadelphia basement. We also know this because the fetus, her ovaries, most of her large intestine, and the tips of both of her breasts had been removed and left on the floor beneath her. The amount of blood at the scene, coupled with deep clawing gouges in the brick walls, led the attending medical examiner to conclude these atrocities had been committed while Tilly Jane was still alive and conscious. 10 years later, in 1941, a group of feminist mediums held a seance in the basement in an attempt to summon Tilly Jane and learn the killer's identity. The latter goal was not achieved, but the former was, as this photo taken by one of the attendees makes disturbingly clear. Photo 30. The Trinity Deception. This is one of several famous photographs taken of the first ever nuclear detonation, conducted by the US Army on July 16, 1945, in the White Sands Proving Ground, located in the Jornada del Muerto Desert, about 35 miles southwest of Socorro, New Mexico. The setting off of this implosion-designed plutonium device, the same method used in the Fat Man device dropped on Nagasaki, ushered in the atomic age and the eventual arms race between the United States and Russia. Only a handful of people were aware that the photo was cropped before it was released to the public, and they are all now dead. One of them was the original photographer, who gave the author a copy of the original on the condition it be kept out of the public eye until such a time the citizens of the world could handle the ramifications of what it depicts. Photo 3. The Watchers at the Window. For years, guests staying at this room in the old Riverside Inn in Jenner, California, had complained of feeling watched through the window. but it wasn't until 1964 when a San Francisco travel writer named Michael Irwin thought to set up a timed exposure that evidence of actual voyeurs was brought to light. Irwin lay on the mostly obscured bed in the foreground and read a book while his camera took a series of long exposures. When he showed this photo to the hotel owner, he was promptly asked to leave. 2 days later, the owner was dead by his own hand, and Irwin was left a creepy picture and an unsolved mystery. The identities of the children remain unknown. Photo 23. The Winged Thing. Almost nothing is known about this image. Who took it? When? What it depicts? Why is it so overexposed? In early 1968, several months after the Mothman sightings in Point Pleasant, West Virginia, a vintage silver print of it was mailed without a return address and in a plain yellow envelope with a heavy weight clasp to the Special Collections divisions of the New York Public Library. Experts there could find no evidence of doctoring and thought the image itself was quite old, possibly from the 19th century. It remained there uncatalogued until the library sold off a small portion of its undesired holdings in the early 70s. From there, it passed through several hands until joining the present collection. Photo 8. What Killed Jane Doe? Drag marks in the leaves and mud led Ohio hunter Earl Guthrie to a bizarre scene in 1959. He found a young and still unidentified female victim dead, pale and withered, as if, in his own words, something had drank her dry. Her arms were embedded deeply into the soft earth beneath her and pinned back at an extreme angle. Her face was turned away and contorted as if in pain or terror. Arriving first, a local photographer aiding the police took one quick shot before an overwhelming sense of dread drove him back to the gravel road where he had parked. State police arrived several minutes later, but when they returned to the scene, the body was gone. Pareidolia is certainly in play, but one can't help but see in the bushes behind the poor woman some demonic mirror of whatever it was that took her.